going to start with symptoms. And so what we're looking at here in this diagram, what you can see here are some of the major symptoms that we see. So you've got here anemia. Now, with anemia, there are different kinds of anemia that can occur, but the most common, most well referenced is something called megaloblastic anemia. What does that mean? The anemia component is, let's draw a different color here. So inside your long bones, you have bone marrow, and inside that marrow, you have what's called stem cells. These stem cells are precursors, if you will, to forming red blood cells, RBCs. Okay, so when we're talking about anemia, generally we're talking about red blood cells in particular, but a megaloblastic anemia is when your red blood cells are first born, they're born very large, and as they mature, they get smaller, and as they continue to mature, they lose their nucleus, and they take on hemoglobin, and they become discoid in shape. So that discoid shape, if you ever studied biology in high school, it's that divot in the red blood cell, that discoid divot that carries oxygen and carbon dioxide through the bloodstream. And so this maturation process is an important part of how a red blood cell evolves into a normal functioning red blood cell. So what happens here is you've got vitamin B12 is necessary for the stem cells to generate red blood cells. It's also necessary for the maturation process. So you got B12 playing a role in both of these areas, and this is why we call it megaloblastic. Mega means big, so the cells get stuck in this size, and when they're stuck here and they don't evolve to carry oxygen very well, then we have red blood cells, but we don't have the capacity to carry the oxygen. Think of these cells, these bigger cells, as clumsy and unable to do the job. And that's where anemia oftentimes can come from. And this is different than iron deficiency anemia that so many relate to celiac disease. So if you've paid attention to me for the last few weeks, we talked about iron as being a common deficiency in those with gluten sensitivity. As a matter of fact, iron deficiency is number one, okay, in people with gluten sensitivity. B12, in my experience and research, is number two. So think of it like this. The top two deficiencies that gluten can cause, we'll talk about how in just a minute, are iron and B12 deficiency. Both cause anemia, but B12 deficiency causes a different kind of anemia than an iron deficiency anemia. An iron deficiency causes a small cell anemia. So if we kind of expand this out, this red blood cell is even smaller, okay? And we call that microacidic anemia, microacidic hypochromic, meaning it's a small and a pale red blood cell, and it doesn't carry oxygen very well either, but they look very, very different on blood tests. They're obviously very different causes, but sometimes people with gluten issues have both iron and B12 deficiency. So there's a mixed bag, and their blood tests aren't always 100% accurate, which is why it's so important to measure these nutrients appropriately. And I'll get into how to measure B12 before we wrap up tonight around B12. Now, in addition, so aside from the anemia, we can also, it doesn't just have to be a red blood cell anemia. B12 deficiency can also stimulate white blood cells. And so some people develop low white counts, and that's important. Why? Especially if you're trying to fight colds and flus. This time of the year as we go into cold and flu season, you want your immune system to be strong. Well, B12 deficiency can cause a lowered white count. It can also cause a lowered platelet count. So again, B12 can affect, because it affects the stem cells in the marrow and their development into red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. It can affect all three. Now, let's make some room here. B12 can also contribute to depression. It's actually one of the top causes of depression that I have seen clinically when people come in. A lot of times when we're looking at their nutritional status, depression is just a side effect that they have. We're measuring their nutrients, and we find vitamin B12 deficiency quite common in cases of depression. And there are a lot of reasons why. A couple of different chemicals that B12 is important for, one of them is homocysteine elevation. So too much homocysteine, which can be caused by vitamin B12 deficiency, can be neurotoxic. So it can damage the brain, it can damage nerve cells. And this is one of the reasons why we'll sometimes see people form depression. But B12 also is important for the production of the myelin sheath in your nerves, which is the insulation around your nerves. And so for these main reasons, we'll see depression develop. Remember, depression is generally, it's a neurological problem. So these two, the depression and the neuropathy, so we can get, and really even when we look at dementia, there's some of the earlier research is showing the connection between homocysteine and dementia, or memory or cognitive decline, as well as myelin sheath disturbances. And so again, these all three, kind of think of these more specifically as neurological types of problems. Now, this is super common. A lot of people don't realize they go to the doctor, they got numbness and tingling in their hands or feet. And most people, when they have those types of symptoms, they're thinking, oh, I have a problem with my hand or my feet directly, like a physical problem, like physical trauma. Some people are told they have like herniated discs. And it's not to say that you can't have a physical impingement on a nerve, because there's carpal tunnel syndrome, there's cubital tunnel syndrome, there's all different types of nerve impingement syndromes that can cause neuropathy. But in my experience, it's very, very common for B12 deficiency to be overlooked. And so if you've got numbness, tingling, temperature, sensation changes in your hands, feet, your periphery, and you don't know why, and there was no trauma, you never injured your back or neck, think vitamin B12. If you have something called ascending neuropathy, and so let me delineate what that is. Ascending neuropathy means the nerve damage starts in either the toes or the fingers, and it moves its way up. Instead of starting from the spine and moving its way out and down, it starts from the extremity and moves its way up. And generally this is in the feet, when it moves up the leg into the pelvis region. That's called an ascending neuropathy, and this is almost always, in my experience anyway, a B vitamin deficiency, particularly vitamin B12. So if you've got a neuropathy, just keep this in mind, that ascending neuropathy. I've seen cases where doctors were looking and they were doing CT images of the spine, they were doing MRIs of the spine, trying to find damage to the spine itself that's leading to that neuropathy. But when the neuropathy starts from the bottom and works its way up, generally it's, again, I want you to just emphasize, usually it's B12 contributing to that problem. Then we come down to some of these other symptoms. Joint pain. Joint pain is actually quite commonly caused, joint and muscle pain both. Let's make some more room. When you're low in B12, what happens, generally speaking, is your muscles, let me spell that out just for the sake of doing it. So your muscles have depleted O2 levels. They can't get adequate oxygen. One of the reasons this happens, it starts with the anemia. So the anemia itself creates the joint and muscle pain because of a lack of oxygen. Remember what happens when your muscles don't get adequate oxygen. They have to, if you guys ever worked out in the gym, you've ever heard anybody talk about aerobic exercise versus anaerobic. As a matter of fact, I'll give away a free copy of No Grain, No Pain to the first person who understands the difference between aerobic and anaerobic. So whoever we got in the feed that answers that question first, who knows that difference, we're going to give you a free copy of No Grain, No Pain. And Mel will clock that for us. So what happens in your muscle is there's two kinds of metabolism. So your muscle can generate energy either one of these ways, through anaerobic or through aerobic metabolism. If you do it with aerobic metabolism, in essence, if your muscle's working from this mode of operandi, you get energy without pain. If your muscle's generating anaerobically, then you get less energy because it's not an efficient way to generate energy with pain. Do we got any answers on that question yet?
No, we got one.
Okay, it looks like we got one. Okay, so we got a right answer. It looks like, I don't know what the call sign, Jyan, Jyan. Is that the right one? Is that the? Yeah. So he wins or she wins. I don't know. But aerobic means with oxygen, anaerobic means without oxygen. And so what happens is when you don't have oxygen, as in the case of an anemia caused by B12 deficiency, your muscles don't have enough oxygen to generate energy. So they generate energy less efficiently. And with that comes pain. The pain of what? Of lactic acid. This is a normal metabolic waste product when our muscles are trying to generate energy and don't have adequate oxygen. And so this begins to hurt. So if you've ever worked out and you were doing some exercise and the muscle started to burn so bad that you had to stop, it's common. It's why people stop lifting the weight, right? Because it hurts and it burns so bad. Well, that's lactic acid doing that, and then you have to rest and allow for that oxygen to recover in the muscle, and then that pain will slowly start to go away. Now imagine you're making lactic acid all the time because you're just chronically anemic and you don't have enough oxygen ever, and so your muscles, even walking up the stairs creates pain, or walking across the kitchen, or just, bending over to put your shoes on, you're using your muscle, but there's so little oxygen for your muscles to generate energy. You're chronically generating this substance that creates this low level of pain that you're always in. And that's one of the reasons why joint muscle pain are common manifestations of long-term vitamin B12 deficiency. We also get lethargy or brain fog, right, which goes hand in hand with this, but also, it has to do with this. So a lot of the symptoms of B12 deficiency have to do with the fact that low B12 creates anemia that then leads to other types of problems. So anemia is like the lead domino. Once that domino falls, it cascades and a bunch of other symptoms follow. But brain fog and lethargy, very, very common. Hair loss is a common symptom of vitamin B12 deficiency. And really, one of the big reasons why is because B12 deficiency oftentimes is associated with protein deficiency, because where we get most of our B12 comes from protein. And so we'll see this especially true in people who are following vegetarian diets, and we'll get into that in a minute, but they're maybe not getting adequate protein. And again, with that lack of protein comes a lack of B12 food sources, and so we get this hair loss. Remember, your hair is protein. We'll also see on the tongue, we'll see the tongue develop swelling. That's what glossitis means. It's a redness or swelling of the tongue. So the tongue becomes kind of bulbous and bigger. And I'll see sometimes people will start to develop, their tongue gets so thick, they'll develop sleep apnea, and their doctor will tell them you have sleep apnea because of swelling in the throat. But really what can happen is this tongue can get really, really big and it can block the airway. And so these are all symptoms of vitamin B12 deficiency. In my experience, probably some of the most common and the most subtle, like the ones that develop early on. The first one is really brain fog, is super, super common. And I asked a poll, and those of you who come in and haven't answered it yet, but I think where are we at in our poll right now? We've got over 100 answers in the poll, and I asked the question is, do you struggle with brain fog most days? And so far, 56% of you say yes, that you struggle with brain fog. We'll cap that out at the end, but that's so far, we're just 100 votes in or so. So again, one of the other symptoms of B12 deficiency that I wanted to point out tonight, because a lot of you are struggling with this one, we'll pull this research study up. You won't hear this stuff anywhere else. I'm the first. Where'd it go? Let's just move it down, and there we go, right here. So this study on vitamin B12, the effect of vitamin B12 deficiency on olfactory function. This is your sense of smell. So olfactory is smell. And so a lot of you don't have your sense of smell right now. If you've developed, especially if you've developed colds or the disease that shall not be named, here's what I wanted to point out to you. So vitamin B12 affects the sense of smell. In this research study, these researchers showed for the first time that olfactory dysfunction, meaning loss of sense of smell, may be present in patients with vitamin B12 deficiency. Keep that in mind as another symptom as we move through the show tonight. At the very end, I've got kind of some special research for you that I'm going to show you. So just keep that in mind as we move through. Hey, don't forget to check out the rest of the series right here. Make sure you hit subscribe below. And as always, thanks for tuning in.